It was supposed to be a simple favor, just a quick knock on my neighbor's door to drop off her misplaced package. But when Sarah opened that door, her radiant smile and those piercing eyes pulled me into a moment I couldn't shake. I thought I was delivering a box. Instead, I walked into a story that would change everything. She invited me in, her voice warm and welcoming. "You've been such a lifesaver," she said, motioning toward her cozy apartment. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. Her place felt like her, a blend of elegance and comfort, with soft lighting that made everything seem more intimate. "Coffee?" she offered, already moving toward the kitchen. I nodded, unsure of what else to do. The air between us felt charged, though I couldn't tell if it was just me imagining things. I watched her as she brewed the coffee, her movements graceful, her laughter light as we exchanged casual small talk. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed. It was nothing, really, an accidental touch. But my heart reacted as though it had been deliberate. The way she smiled at me made me wonder if she felt it too. We sat on her couch, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing at all. The way her eyes lit up when she laughed was mesmerizing. I could feel myself getting drawn in, like the air around us was thick with something unspoken. Every glance, every word, felt like it carried a double meaning. By the time I finally stood to leave, the room felt different, almost electric. She walked me to the door, her smile lingering as she said, "We should do this again sometime." "Definitely," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. As I stepped back into the hallway, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a casual neighborly coffee. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for where it might lead. I had always considered myself an average guy, working a regular job, keeping to myself, and adjusting to life in a new city. It had only been a few months since I'd moved into this quiet neighborhood, trying to settle into my own routine after years of living with roommates. For the first time, I felt independent, though a little lonely. My apartment was small but comfortable, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I hadn't made an effort to get to know them. Most days, I was too preoccupied with work deadlines or zoning out in front of the TV to think about building connections. I liked my space. It was predictable and safe. And then there was her, Sarah, the neighbor I'd only seen in passing. She was the kind of woman you couldn't help but notice, not because she tried to stand out, but because she had an effortless charm about her. I'd caught glimpses of her here and there, walking her dog or picking up groceries, but our conversations were limited to polite nods and brief hellos. I wasn't prepared for how quickly everything would change. It started with a simple mix-up, a package that had been delivered to my door by mistake. Her name was printed on the box in bold letters, and I thought nothing of it as I decided to drop it off after work. A kind gesture, nothing more. When I knocked on her door that evening, I expected a brief exchange, a quick thanks, and nothing else. But when Sarah opened the door, I was struck by how warm and inviting she seemed. Her smile wasn't just polite, it was radiant, almost as if she was genuinely happy to see me. She insisted I come in for coffee, and though I hesitated at first, there was something in her voice that made it impossible to say no. Her apartment was cozy, with soft lighting and an inviting scent that seemed to reflect her personality, warm, vibrant, and full of life. I didn't realize it then, but that simple encounter was the beginning of something unexpected, something that would pull me out of my predictable world and into hers, a world I was both drawn to and hesitant to enter. At first, everything seemed innocent, refreshing even. Sarah and I started talking more after that night, sharing stories about our jobs, our favorite places in the city, and the little quirks of our building. It felt natural, like an easy connection that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to surface. But soon, subtle things began to gnaw at me. It wasn't anything overt. In fact, it was precisely the smallness of it all that made me question my judgment. For instance, Sarah seemed overly interested in knowing about my schedule, when I worked, when I stayed home, when I went to bed. It was casual on the surface, hidden in playful banter, but it left me wondering why she cared. Then, there were her sudden text messages. They started arriving at odd hours, often late at night, with simple questions like, "Are you awake?" or "What are you up to right now?" Sometimes, they were accompanied by pictures, a selfie of her holding a glass of wine or her dog curled up on the couch. They were harmless enough, but they made my heart race in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was during one of these late-night exchanges that the first real pang of suspicion hit me. She had sent a photo of herself, laughing with a glass of wine, and the caption read, "Wish you were here to share this with me." The words seemed innocent at first glance, but there was something about the way she looked in the photo, her eyes, the relaxed way she leaned into the frame, that felt far too personal. My thoughts spiraled. Was I reading too much into this? Or was there more to her friendliness than I'd allowed myself to admit? I told myself it was nothing. She was probably just lonely, reaching out for company in a city that could often feel isolating. But even as I convinced myself, a voice in the back of my head whispered otherwise. The turning point came one evening when I passed her apartment after work. Her door was slightly ajar, and I heard faint laughter coming from inside, a man's voice mingling with hers. I paused, unsure why I cared so much, but I couldn't stop myself from wondering who he was. It shouldn't have mattered. Sarah and I were just neighbors. Friends, at most. But it did matter. It mattered more than I was willing to admit. The next day, she knocked on my door, holding a plate of cookies she said she'd baked. Her smile was as bright as ever, but something about her felt different, like she was hiding a piece of herself from me. I wanted to ask her about the man I'd heard the night before, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain the jealousy bubbling beneath my polite exterior when I had no right to feel it? Over the following weeks, Sarah's behavior became even harder to pin down. Sometimes she was warm and inviting, going out of her way to include me in her life. Other times she seemed distant, distracted, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. The inconsistency kept me on edge, making me question not just her intentions, but my own feelings. I began to notice little things I hadn't before, how she'd glance over her shoulder when we were together, or how she always seemed to be checking her phone, even during our most engaging conversations. And then there were her excuses. Plans would be made, then abruptly canceled, often with vague explanations that left me wondering if I was the only one invested in whatever this was. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the way she made me feel, exhilarated and uncertain, all at once. I started to wonder if I was in over my head. Sarah was a mystery I couldn't unravel, and the more I tried, the more tangled I became in the web of my own emotions. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, even if I couldn't name it. And yet, despite my growing doubts, I found myself drawn to her more than ever. It was a dangerous pull, one I wasn't sure I could resist. The line between friendship and something more began to blur, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what it all meant. Every encounter with Sarah felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the way she looked at me or the way her laugh lingered in the air. It was the way she seemed to be drawing me into her world, slowly, deliberately, as if daring me to cross a boundary I wasn't sure I could step back from. It started with little things. A casual touch on my arm when she laughed at one of my jokes. The way her voice softened when she said my name. Once, as we walked back from grabbing coffee, she brushed against me, her hand grazing mine for a moment longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of her skin even after she pulled away, leaving me wondering if it had been accidental or intentional. Then, there was the night she invited me over for dinner. It wasn't unusual. We had spent time together before. But something about this invitation felt different. She was quieter than usual when I arrived, her smile softer, her movements more deliberate. The table was set with candles, and the air carried the scent of freshly baked bread and something rich and savory simmering on the stove. "I wanted to do something nice," she said, when I commented on the effort she had put into the evening. Her cheeks flushed slightly as she glanced away, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was more she wasn't saying. Over dinner, the conversation flowed as easily as ever, but there was an undercurrent of something neither of us could name. Every glance held a little more weight. Every pause between words seemed to stretch longer. When she reached across the table to pour me another glass of wine, her fingers brushed mine, and I felt my breath catch. She didn't pull away immediately, and for a brief second, our eyes met in a way that made the room feel impossibly small. As the evening wore on, I found myself losing track of time, caught up in the rhythm of our exchange. But the tension in the air was undeniable, and it reached its peak when she suggested we move to the couch. "It's more comfortable," she said with a small laugh, though her voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. We sat closer than we ever had before, the space between us shrinking as the conversation shifted from light-hearted banter to something deeper. She spoke about her past, about dreams she'd left behind and regrets she carried, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. There was an intimacy in the exchange that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like we were stepping into uncharted territory together. At one point, a strand of her hair fell across her face, and without thinking, I reached out to tuck it behind her ear. The gesture was instinctive, but the way she looked at me afterward made my heart pound. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something, but no words came. Instead, she leaned closer, her gaze flickering between my eyes and my mouth. I knew I should pull away, create some distance before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in that moment, completely captivated by her. When her hand found mine, her fingers curling around it softly, it felt like every doubt I'd carried vanished in an instant. "This feels dangerous," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the conflict there, the same mix of longing and hesitation that I felt. "It is," I replied, my own voice unsteady. "But it doesn't feel wrong." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, and then, as if the tension between us had reached its breaking point, she closed the gap between us, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was as tentative as it was electrifying. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, as if we were both trying to savor the moment while still grappling with the weight of it. When we pulled away, the silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. She looked at me, her cheeks flushed, her breathing uneven, and I could see the question in her eyes. What now? What did this mean for us? I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure I needed them. All I knew was that I wanted to stay in that moment a little longer, to hold on to the connection we'd just discovered. But even as I leaned back, a part of me couldn't ignore the nagging thought at the back of my mind. This wasn't just about us anymore. Whatever was happening between Sarah and me, it was a thread that could easily unravel everything else in my life. Still, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not when every look, every touch, every kiss felt like stepping into a world I hadn't known I was searching for. Sarah was a risk, a temptation, a door I hadn't meant to open. But now that I had, I wasn't sure I wanted to close it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. Sarah and I didn't talk much about what had happened, but the shift in our dynamic was undeniable. Every look, every accidental touch, every shared moment felt charged with something unspoken. We were dancing on the edge of something forbidden, and though I knew it couldn't last, I couldn't seem to stop myself from getting closer to her. It wasn't long before things came to a head. One Friday evening, Sarah texted me, asking if I'd like to come over for dinner again. Her message was casual on the surface, but I could sense the invitation carried a weight she wasn't addressing. I told myself it was just a friendly meal, a chance to unwind after a long week. But deep down, I knew better. When I arrived at her door, she greeted me with that same radiant smile that had disarmed me the first time. Her apartment smelled of something rich and savory, and soft music played in the background, adding to the intimate atmosphere. She had gone all out again, candles on the table, wine chilling on the counter, and a meal that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. "You're spoiling me," I joked, trying to ease the nervous energy swirling inside me. "Maybe I just like having you here," she replied, her voice softer than usual. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that caught me off guard, and for a moment, I wondered if she was feeling the same sense of unease that I was. Dinner started off light, with laughter and easy conversation. But as the evening wore on, the tension between us grew. I could feel it in the way her gaze lingered on mine a little too long, in the way her hand brushed against mine when she passed the wine. It was as though we were both waiting for something to happen, even if neither of us was brave enough to say it out loud. Eventually, we found ourselves on the couch, our conversation drifting into deeper territory. She talked about her fears, her hopes, and the loneliness she sometimes felt living in the city. I shared more about myself than I ever had before, feeling an inexplicable urge to let her in, to show her the parts of me I usually kept hidden. At some point, the space between us disappeared. I wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly, we were kissing again, and this time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was hungry, urgent, as though we were both trying to capture something fleeting. Her hands tangled in my hair, and mine found her waist, pulling her closer as my heart raced in my chest. It was in that moment, with her lips on mine and her body pressed against me, that the knock came. The sound was jarring, cutting through the haze of the moment like a knife. Sarah and I pulled apart abruptly, both of us breathing heavily as we stared at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, and I saw panic flash in her eyes. "Who is it?" I whispered, my voice low and tense. She shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she murmured, standing up and smoothing her dress as she moved toward the door. I stayed on the couch, my heart pounding as I tried to steady my breathing. When she opened the door, I heard a man's voice, deep, familiar, and unmistakably angry. "Sarah?" What the hell is going on here? I couldn't see him from where I was sitting, but the tone of his voice sent a chill down my spine. Sarah stammered something I couldn't make out, but it was clear she was flustered. The man stepped into view then, his eyes locking onto mine with a look that could have burned through steel. "And who's this?" he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. I, uh, he's a friend," Sarah said quickly, her voice trembling. "He just came over for dinner." The man scoffed, crossing his arms as he glared at me. "A friend? You expect me to believe that?" I stood then, unsure of what else to do. "Look, I think I should go," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing in the room. "No," the man snapped, his attention now fully on me. "You're not going anywhere until someone explains what the hell is going on." "No," the man snapped, his attention now fully on me. "You're not going anywhere until someone explains what the hell is going on." "Mark, stop," Sarah said, stepping between us. "It's not what you think." Mark, her boyfriend. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked at Sarah, searching for some kind of explanation, some sign that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. But her silence told me everything I needed to know. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, shaking my head as the weight of the situation settled on my chest. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me?" She looked at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said softly. "I didn't think it would go this far." Her words stung more than I expected, and I realized just how deeply I'd let myself fall for her. I felt like a fool, a pawn in whatever game she'd been playing with Mark. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with anger and betrayal. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice cold as I turned to leave. Mark didn't try to stop me, but his glare followed me all the way to the door. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. The connection I thought we'd shared, the spark that had seemed so real, it was all built on a lie. Sarah wasn't who I thought she was, and I wasn't sure I could ever look at her the same way again. The sound of her voice calling after me stopped me in my tracks. "Wait," she said, her tone desperate. "Please, just don't go like this." I turned to face her, my heart heavy with a mix of anger and sadness. "What do you want me to say, Sarah? That this is okay? That I'm okay?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked at me, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Whatever we'd had, or thought we'd had, was over, and there was no going back. The silence in my apartment was deafening. Days had passed since that night, but the weight of it lingered like a storm cloud I couldn't escape. My thoughts were consumed by the look on Sarah's face, the tears in her eyes as I walked away. I wanted to forget it all, to push it out of my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head. I felt a mix of anger, hurt, and something I couldn't quite place. Maybe regret. Not just for what had happened, but for allowing myself to get so deeply involved in the first place. I had ignored the red flags, the little signs that something wasn't quite right, because I wanted to believe that the connection we shared was real. But now, it all felt like a cruel joke. Sarah hadn't reached out since that night, and part of me was grateful for the silence. I didn't know what I would say to her if she did. What was there to say? She had lied, kept a massive part of her life hidden, and dragged me into a situation I never wanted to be in. But another part of me, the part that had fallen for her, missed her terribly. I hated that I still thought about her laugh, her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about something she loved. It made the betrayal sting even more. Work became my escape. I threw myself into my projects, staying late at the office just to avoid coming home to the emptiness that seemed to cling to my apartment. But even there, I couldn't fully escape her. Every so often, I'd catch myself staring at my phone, half expecting a message from her. I hated myself for it, for wanting to hear from her after everything that had happened. Then, one evening, as I sat on my couch nursing a glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt before I could stop myself, and when I saw her name on the screen, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions: relief, anger, and that damn spark of hope I couldn't extinguish. The message was short. "Can we talk? Please." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to delete the message and move on. But another part of me, the part that still couldn't let go, typed a reply before I could stop myself. "When?" She responded almost immediately. "Tonight? My place?" Against my better judgment, I found myself standing outside her door an hour later, my heart pounding in my chest. When she opened the door, she looked different. Tired, worn down, like she hadn't slept in days. There was no trace of the confident, radiant woman I had first met. She stepped aside silently, and I walked in, unsure of what to expect. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, closing the door behind me. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, and it caught me off guard. "I didn't think you would." "I wasn't sure I should," I replied, my tone colder than I intended. She winced, but nodded, as if she had expected it. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I should have told you about Mark, but I didn't know how. And then things got complicated." "Complicated?" I scoffed, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "You lied to me, Sarah. You pulled me into your mess without even giving me the chance to decide if I wanted to be involved." She looked down, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're right," she said softly. "I have no excuse for what I did. I didn't expect to feel the way I did about you. It caught me off guard." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to be angry, to hold on to my resentment, but the pain in her voice made it impossible to shut her out completely. Still, I couldn't let her off the hook so easily. "So what now?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Do you expect me to just forget everything? Pretend like none of this happened?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't expect that. I wanted to apologize, to tell you the truth." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Mark and we've been having problems for a while. I thought we could fix things, but when you came into my life, everything changed. I realized I couldn't keep pretending. That night, when he showed up, it wasn't supposed to happen like that. I'm sorry." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But another part of me, the part that had been burned before, couldn't ignore the damage that had already been done. "I don't know if I can trust you," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "You've lied to me, Sarah, and no matter how sorry you are, that's not something I can just forget." She nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted you to know how I feel, and that I'm ending things with Mark. I can't keep living like this." Her confession caught me off guard, but I didn't know if it changed anything. The damage was done, and even if she was telling the truth now, I wasn't sure I could open myself up to her again. I need time, I said finally, standing to leave. I can't give you an answer right now. She nodded, her expression heartbroken but understanding. Take all the time you need. As I walked out of her apartment, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope I wasn't ready to face. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging I'd ever experienced. Even as I tried to focus on work and regain a sense of normalcy, thoughts of Sarah lingered in the back of my mind. Her apology, her tears, the raw honesty in her voice. It all haunted me, making it impossible to move on entirely. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened, not just between Sarah and me, but within myself. I'd let my guard down, allowed myself to trust someone in a way I hadn't in years, only to find out that things weren't as they seemed. It wasn't the first time I'd been hurt, but this felt different. It felt heavier, more personal. For a while, I avoided her entirely. I ignored the occasional text she sent, short messages asking how I was, or letting me know she was thinking about me. I wasn't ready to face her, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But no matter how hard I tried to shut her out, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared. One quiet evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, I found myself replaying everything she'd said that night. Her admission about Mark, her apology, the vulnerability in her eyes. It all felt genuine. Maybe she hadn't handled things the right way, but her feelings for me seemed real. And as much as I wanted to stay angry, I couldn't deny that I missed her. Eventually, I decided I needed closure, one way or another. I reached out to her, agreeing to meet for coffee at a quiet cafe near our building. When I arrived, she was already there, nervously fidgeting with her cup. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mix of hope and trepidation. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly, her voice laced with emotion. I nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I think we both need this," I replied, my tone neutral, but not unkind. The conversation that followed was raw and honest. She didn't hold back, admitting her mistakes and the guilt she'd carried since the night Mark confronted us. She told me she had ended things with him, that she couldn't keep living a double life. Her words were filled with remorse, but there was also a quiet strength in her voice that I hadn't noticed before. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I needed you to know that I'm trying to be better. For myself and for you, if you'll let me." Her vulnerability disarmed me. I could see how much she regretted what had happened, how much she wanted to make things right. But I also knew that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. "I can't promise you anything," I said, after a long pause. "But I'm willing to try, if you are. We take it slow, no expectations. I need to know that I can trust you." Her face lit up with a mix of relief and gratitude, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't a perfect solution, and I knew there would be challenges ahead, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, we began rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was making the right choice. But slowly, piece by piece, we started to find our way back to each other. Through it all, I learned some hard but valuable lessons. I learned that love, even when it's real, is never simple. I learned that people are flawed, and sometimes they make mistakes that hurt the ones they care about most. But I also learned that forgiveness, when earned, can be a powerful thing. Sarah and I weren't perfect, and we had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, we could turn this painful chapter into something worth holding on to. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Could you forgive someone who kept such a big secret? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this complicated story. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.